I worked at a small coffee shop. Every day I'd make lattes, cappuccinos, and more. But one night, something strange happened. I was closing up, and it was getting dark outside. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the coffee machine humming. I was cleaning the espresso machine when I heard a soft giggle. It sounded like a child's laugh. I looked around, but there was no one there. I figured it was my imagination, so I kept working. As I wiped down the counter, I felt a cold breeze on my neck. I turned, but the windows were closed. The giggle came again, closer this time. It made my heart race. I wanted to leave, but I had to finish closing. I started hearing whispers, like a group of people talking just out of earshot. It was unsettling. I called out, "Is anyone there?" No answer. The lights flickered, and then they went out completely. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The whispering got louder, like a crowd of people murmuring all around me. I heard footsteps, but when I shone my light, there was no one. The giggle turned into a chilling laugh. I felt trapped, like something was closing in on me. My hands were trembling. I decided to make a run for the door. As I reached for it, a hand grabbed my wrist. I screamed and pulled away. It was ice cold, and I could barely see the outline of fingers in my flashlight beam. I yanked myself free and ran out into the dark street. The coffee shop had turned into a nightmare. The whispers and laughter followed me, echoing in my ears. I knew I had to get help, so I ran to the nearest house and pounded on the door. A man opened it and looked at me in confusion. I told him about the coffee shop, but he just stared at me like I was crazy. He didn't hear the whispers or the laughter. He said he'd call the police to calm me down. The police arrived, and I told them the same story. They went to check the coffee shop, but when they came back, they said everything was normal. I couldn't believe it. The horror I experienced was real, but they couldn't find any evidence of it. I didn't want to go back to that coffee shop, but I had to get my stuff. The police escorted me, and when we entered, the lights were back on, and it was just a regular coffee shop. I felt like I was losing my mind. I quit my job that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place. I never went back, and I always avoided that street. To this day, I don't know what happened in that coffee shop. I can't explain the whispers, the laughter, and the icy hand that grabbed me. I just know I'll never forget that night, and I'll never step foot in that coffee shop again. I used to work as a barista in a small coffee shop, nestled on a quiet street. The regulars and the smell of freshly brewed coffee made it feel like a cozy place. But one evening, something happened that turned it all into a nightmare. It was getting dark outside when a stranger walked in. He had pale skin and eyes that seemed darker than night. He ordered a black coffee, but his gaze sent a shiver down my spine. As I prepared his drink, he whispered something that I couldn't quite catch. He left with his coffee without saying another word. After that, strange things began to happen. Late at night, when I was closing up, I heard footsteps in the empty café. But when I turned around, no one was there. The radio started playing on its own, and the coffee machine would start brewing coffee by itself. My co-workers noticed it too. We tried to laugh it off, blaming it on faulty equipment or just our imaginations. But it became harder to ignore when cups and saucers began to move on their own, and the chairs in the cafe were rearranged in strange patterns overnight. One evening, when it was just me and my co-worker Lori closing up, the stranger walked in again. He ordered his black coffee, and this time, I strained to hear his whispered words. He said, "It's coming for you." I didn't know what he meant, but it sent shivers down my spine. Lori and I exchanged nervous glances. When we turned back to the stranger, he was gone, leaving behind only his untouched coffee. That night, after closing, Lori and I decided to investigate. We looked up the history of the cafe and found a newspaper article from years ago. It talked about a murder that happened right in the very spot where our coffee shop now stood. The victim was a barista, just like me. Her killer was never found, and the case remained unsolved. Lori and I were spooked, but we dismissed it as a mere coincidence. We decided to set up our phones to record what happened overnight. We were determined to get to the bottom of this mystery. The night was eerily quiet, and the hours seemed to drag on. Around 2 a.m., the recording showed the coffee cups and saucers slowly moving on their own. We watched in disbelief as the chairs rearranged themselves into that same strange pattern. The radio suddenly blared to life, playing a haunting tune that echoed through the empty cafe. Then we saw a shadowy figure moving in the background. It was the same stranger who had visited the cafe earlier. He whispered something we couldn't hear clearly, but it sent a chill down our spines. We knew we had to confront him. The next evening, as we prepared for the stranger's return, we noticed a strange symbol etched into the cafe's floor. It looked like a circle with strange markings. We had no idea what it meant, but it seemed connected to the eerie events. Sure enough, the stranger came in. We confronted him about the symbol and the strange happenings. He revealed that he was the brother of the barista who had been murdered in the same spot years ago. He believed that her spirit was trapped here and that the symbol was a way to communicate with her. The stranger explained that the spirit was restless and needed closure. He wanted to help his sister move on to the afterlife, but he needed our help. He asked us to perform a ritual to free her spirit. It involved using the symbol, coffee, and the cafe's history. We were hesitant, but the strange occurrences had become too much to bear. We agreed to help, hoping it would put an end to the disturbing events. The ritual was performed that very night. We lit candles and placed the coffee cup in the center of the symbol. We recited words of peace and forgiveness, and for the first time, we heard the barista's voice. She thanked us for helping her find peace and forgiveness. As we finished the ritual, a soft, calming breeze swept through the cafe. The haunting occurrences stopped, and the stranger's brother thanked us and left the cafe with a sense of closure. From that day on, the cafe felt peaceful and welcoming once again. The memory of the barista's tragic fate was finally put to rest, and we could enjoy serving coffee without the fear of strange, unsettling events. I used to work at a coffee shop. My job was simple, making coffee and chatting with customers. But something happened that made me quit. It was a spooky and unsettling experience. It all started one dark and rainy evening. The cafe was almost empty, and I was closing up when a man walked in. He was tall, with shaggy hair and a ragged coat. His eyes were cold, and he had a strange, intense look on his face. I greeted him with a smile, but he didn't respond. He just stared at me. I had a goosebumps, but I tried to shake it off. I asked him what he wanted, and he mumbled something, but I couldn't understand him, so I asked again. He finally said, "Black coffee, no sugar." I prepared his coffee and handed it to him. He took it without a word and sat down at a corner table, still staring at me. I went about my work, but I couldn't help but feel uneasy, and I couldn't ignore it. I kept stealing glances at him, and every time I looked, he was still staring at me, sipping his coffee without blinking. Closing time came, and I started turning off the lights and locking the doors. As I was about to leave, the man stood up and walked towards me. He whispered, "Can I use your restroom?" I nodded and pointed to the restroom. He went inside, and I waited by the door, hoping he would leave soon. Minutes passed, and he didn't come out. I knocked on the door and asked if he was okay. There was no response. I was getting scared now. I considered calling the police, but before I could, he opened the door and walked out. He still had that intense look on his face, and his coat was dripping wet. I asked if he was done, and he nodded. He paid for his coffee and left without a word. I locked the door behind him, relieved that he was gone. I couldn't explain it, but his presence had left me deeply disturbed. The next day, he came back. I was hoping he wouldn't, but there he was, standing at the door as if he'd never left. He ordered the same black coffee, and I made it for him. This time, he didn't go to the restroom. He just sat at his usual table staring at me. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked over to him and asked, Why are you always staring at me?" He smiled, but it was an evil smile that sent shivers down my spine. He whispered, "You have something I need." I didn't understand what he meant. I was about to call the police, but he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, old-fashioned pocket watch. It was rusty and covered in dust. He placed it on the table and said, "This watch is cursed, and I need to pass it on to someone. It's your turn now." I didn't know what to say. I didn't believe in curses, but there was something about the watch that made me uneasy. It had a strange, eerie glow, and the ticking was loud and irregular. He insisted I take it, so I did. I wanted him to leave, and I thought it would get rid of him. He left the cafe, and I was alone with the watch. I put it in my pocket and tried to forget about it, but that night, I had the most disturbing dream. I was in a dark, endless forest, and the trees were whispering my name. I heard a voice, cold and sinister, saying, "You have something that doesn't belong to you." I woke up in a cold sweat, and the watch was on my bedside table, ticking loudly. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, the man returned, but he was different. He looked older, with a haggard and tired expression. He asked for the watch, but I refused to give it back. I told him to leave me alone. He became angry and threatened me. He said the curse would haunt me until I passed the watch on to someone else. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped and scared. I begged him to take the watch back, but he just laughed and left. As time went by, and I couldn't get rid of the watch, it became an obsession. The nightmares continued, and I could hear whispers in the dark. I saw shadowy figures lurking in the corners of my vision. I was losing my sanity. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to go to the old man's house and give him the cursed watch back. I found his address in a dusty phone book and drove to his place. It was a decrepit, abandoned house in the middle of nowhere. The windows were broken, and the front door creaked open as I entered. I called out for him, but there was no response. I searched the house room by room, but he was nowhere to be found. Finally, I entered the basement, and there he was, lying on the floor, motionless. I rushed to his side and tried to wake him up, but he was cold and lifeless. The watch was still in my pocket, ticking loudly. I knew I had to get rid of it, so I placed it on the old man's chest. As soon as I did, the watch stopped ticking, and the room was filled with an eerie silence. I ran out of the house and drove back to the cafe. I locked the watch in a box and buried it deep in my backyard. The nightmares stopped, and the shadowy figures disappeared. I was finally free from the curse. 3 years ago, I worked as a barista in a cozy little coffee shop. The place was small and always full of people chatting, working on their laptops, or simply sipping their coffee. It was a typical cafe, until one day when something strange started happening. It all began with a new customer, a woman with long, unkempt hair and ragged clothes. She walked in one morning and ordered a black coffee. Her eyes were hollow, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. As I handed her the coffee, she whispered, "You'll see them too." I didn't understand what she meant, but I didn't think much of it. People say weird things sometimes. However, from that day on, things took a creepy turn. I started seeing shadowy figures out of the corner of my eye, lurking in the corners of the coffee shop. They seemed to move closer whenever I tried to get a better look. The customers also noticed the strange occurrences. They would often complain about the sudden drops in temperature and whispering voices when no one was talking. I felt a chill run down my spine as I brewed coffee, and it wasn't just from the cold air conditioning. The coffee shop's atmosphere grew tense, and my co-workers and I were on edge. We tried to ignore the strange happenings, but they became impossible to ignore. One night, while closing up, I heard a voice behind me whispering, "Join us." I turned around, but no one was there. It felt like the walls themselves were talking to me. I couldn't sleep at night, plagued by nightmares of the shadowy figures. They reached out for me, their hands cold and grasping. I woke up in a cold sweat, afraid to go back to the coffee shop, but I had bills to pay, and I couldn't just quit my job. One day, as I was pouring a latte, I saw a figure in the coffee's steam. It was a face, twisted in agony, staring back at me. I dropped the cup, shattering it on the floor. The customers gasped, and I stammered an apology, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the face that had appeared for just a moment. The woman who had first warned me about the strange occurrences returned. She seemed even more haggard than before. She approached me, her eyes pleading. "You have to leave. They're getting closer." I was desperate for answers, so I asked her who they were. She told me they were lost souls trapped in the coffee shop and that they wanted me to join them. I didn't want to believe her, but I couldn't ignore the unsettling things I had seen and heard. That night, I decided to stay in the coffee shop after closing hours. I wanted to confront whatever was hounding the place. As I sat in the dimly lit café, I heard the whispers growing louder. The shadowy figures crept closer, their forms becoming more distinct. I felt a cold, bony hand on my shoulder. I turned to see a pale, gaunt face right in front of mine. It was one of the lost souls, its eyes filled with despair. I screamed and ran for the door, but the other figures blocked my path. They surrounded me, their presence suffocating. I could hear their voices, a cacophony of sorrow and longing. They wanted me to stay with them, to become one of them. I could feel their cold, ghostly hands reaching for me, pulling me into their world. In a blind panic, I pushed through the spectral crowd and made it to the door. I fled into the night, never looking back. I quit my job at the coffee shop, leaving behind the nightmares and the lost souls that had haunted it. I walked into the cozy coffee shop, hoping for a relaxing cup of joe. The place was quiet, with the soft hum of chatter and the occasional clinking of cups. I noticed the barista behind the counter. She had an unsettling look in her eyes, like she knew something I didn't. I placed my order for a simple black coffee and found a seat by the window. As I sipped my coffee, I couldn't help but watch the barista. She moved with an eerie grace, her eyes locked on each customer. It was as if she could see into their souls. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as mere paranoia. The coffee was good, and I had work to do. I buried myself in my laptop, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that lingered. As time went by, and I found myself coming back to the coffee shop more often, the barista's unsettling presence had become a part of my routine. She never smiled, never spoke, but her eyes followed me wherever I went. One evening, as I was about to leave, she handed me my coffee. Her fingers brushed against mine, sending a chill through my body. I looked into her eyes, and for a brief moment, I saw something terrifying. It was as if I was staring into the abyss, and it was staring back at me. I rushed out of the coffee shop, heart pounding. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, I had a nightmare. I was trapped in a dark, suffocating place, and the barista was there, her eyes burning into mine. The next morning, I couldn't resist the pull of the coffee shop. It was as if an invisible force was drawing me in. I ordered my usual coffee and took a seat, but this time, I couldn't focus on my work. I kept glancing at the barista, who was now standing at the counter, her eyes fixed on me. I decided to strike up a conversation, hoping to dispel the unease. "How long have you been working here?" I asked. She didn't respond, just continued to stare at me with those unsettling eyes. It was as if she couldn't speak, or didn't want to. I felt a sense of dread building inside me. A few days later, I came to the coffee shop, and something had changed. The once cozy atmosphere had turned into a cold, foreboding place. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the other customers looked pale and lifeless. I approached the counter, my heart pounding. "Can I have my usual, please?" I asked, my voice trembling. The barista nodded and began to prepare my coffee. As she poured it into the cup, I noticed something in the dark liquid. It wasn't the usual rich black coffee. It was thick and murky, like a pool of darkness. I tried to refuse the coffee, but the barista insisted, her eyes burning with intensity. I took a hesitant sip, and a wave of darkness washed over me. I felt myself being pulled into a never-ending abyss, and the barista's face loomed over me, her eyes consuming my very being. I woke up in my own bed, drenched in sweat. It was all a nightmare, or at least I hoped it was. But as I got out of bed, I noticed something on my nightstand. A cup of the same thick, murky coffee from the coffee shop. Panic set in, and I rushed back to the coffee shop. But when I arrived, it was gone. The cozy place I once knew had disappeared, leaving only an empty, dilapidated building in its wake. I never saw the barista again, and I couldn't find any trace of the coffee shop. It was as if it had never existed. But the nightmares continued, and the taste of that dark coffee haunted me, a memory of the barista's dark presence.